High in the cliffs of the American Southwest, there are cities carved into the living rock. Thousands of rooms silent for 7 centuries, no footprints in the dust, no echoes in the canyons. For decades, we were told they disappeared, that a thriving civilization simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only stone, pottery, and a haunting silence. But look closer. These weren't just desert nomads. They were master architects who built the first skyscrapers of North America. They were astronomers who tracked the stars with pinpoint precision and engineers who laid hundreds of miles of straight roads through an unforgiving wilderness. We call them the Anasazi, a name given by their enemies, but their descendants call them something different. And the real story of why they left their magnificent great houses isn't just a mystery of the past, it's a warning for our future. Today, we're going beyond the myths. We're traveling to the Four Corners to uncover the truth about the ancestral Puebloans. What drove them to the cliffs? Was it war, a drying world, or a spiritual transformation? And most importantly, where did they actually go? Now, if you're using this video to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating seeing New York at breakfast and Los Angeles at bedtime, all at once, all of us wondering about the same mysteries. If you've never been to the American Southwest, let me start by painting the simplest version of it. Big sky, sharp light, long distances, and that feeling that the land is doing most of the talking. We're in the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, and even the geography sounds like a crossroads. You drive for a while, and it's open country. Sage, scrub, a few stubborn trees, rock that changes color every couple of miles. And then, almost unfairly, you turn a corner, and there it is. Stone architecture so deliberate, so heavy with human effort, that it doesn't feel like ruins in the casual way people say that word. It feels like a place that expected you to take it seriously. Chaco Canyon is like that. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic skyline. It sits low, tucked into a broad wash, surrounded by mesas and cliffs. And then you realize the canyon floor used to be organized, planned into a landscape of buildings, plazas, and ceremonial spaces that were not supposed to be random, not supposed to be temporary, and definitely not supposed to be small. This is the part where, in a lot of documentaries, someone lowers their voice and says, "a lost civilization," and we get spooky music. I'm not doing that today. Not because the story isn't mysterious, it absolutely is, but because lost is a lazy word here. These weren't aliens, they weren't ghosts, they were people, families, communities, planners, builders, farmers, travelers, leaders, and neighbors. And the real mystery isn't that they vanished. The real mystery is more interesting. How did they build something this complex in this environment without the kind of written records we're used to depending on? And why did the center of that world change so dramatically over time? That's the puzzle that has pulled archaeologists, historians, and native communities into long conversations for more than a century. And honestly, it still pulls in regular visitors who just stand there and go, "How?" So let's start with the what before we get too excited about the why. When people say Chaco, they often mean one big building, Pueblo Bonito, the famous D-shaped great house. But Chaco Canyon is a whole system, and even on a first pass, the scale is hard to wrap your head around. Multiple large complexes, multi-story masonry rooms, big open plazas, and those circular subterranean spaces called kivas, some small, some enormous. The stonework isn't crude, it's patterned and careful, with walls that feel engineered, not improvised. And then there's the timing. These major building phases ramp up around a period we usually place in the late 800s and 900s, and then peak through the thousands into the early 1100s, give or take, depending on the site and the dataset you're looking at. That's a long time to sustain momentum in construction, coordination, and supply lines. And supply is the first thing that should make your brain itch. Because this canyon is not a lush river valley. It's not the Mississippi. It's not coastal California. It's a place where farming is possible but risky, where rain is moody and unpredictable, where a few bad seasons in a row can change everything. And yet, here you have stone buildings that look like they were meant to last, built by people who clearly knew their environment well enough to bet big on it. Now here's where the silence comes in. You walk through these spaces, well, as much as you're allowed to, and you realize you're surrounded by evidence of planning and social organization, but the kind of evidence we're trained to expect is missing. There's no alphabetic writing, no royal inscriptions, no big carved "I, King so-and-so, built this." There are no written histories explaining who was in charge, who allied with whom, what crisis hit in what year. Instead, you get stone, pottery, pollen, tree rings, bone, tool marks, trade items, building alignments, road traces, and 1,000 careful inferences. Archaeology, in other words. A discipline that can be incredibly precise in some ways, like telling you what season a tree was cut, while also leaving you with questions that feel emotional, even philosophical. Who were they? What did they believe? What did they fear? What did they hope to pass on? That's why this story sticks, because Chaco gives you a paradox. It gives you a civilization, let's call it a culture or a regional system, just to keep our terms modest, that was capable of coordination on a huge scale. But it left its voice in a form we have to interpret rather than read. We are used to thinking of complexity as something that comes with paperwork. Chaco forces us to imagine complexity that runs on relationships, on ritual, on memory, on shared practice, on oral tradition, on calendars read from the sky and the horizon, on knowledge held by communities rather than stamped into books. And for a modern audience, especially an American one, that can be a little unsettling, because we're steeped in the idea that if it wasn't written down, it's somehow less real. Standing in Chaco cures you of that pretty quickly. Let me also say something that's worth saying early because it's part of the vibe of this topic. There's a long history of outsiders looking at southwestern ruins and projecting their own fantasies onto them. Sometimes it's romantic, noble builders, mysterious sages, vanished tribes. Sometimes it's darker, savagery, collapse, failure. And sometimes it's just plain wrong, like the old habit of treating these places as abandoned stages waiting for modern people to discover them. A more honest starting point is these places are part of living cultural landscapes. They matter to modern Pueblo peoples, and they have their own histories, their own understandings, and their own boundaries around what should or shouldn't be said in public. So as we go, I'm going to lean on the best archaeological evidence we have, but I'm also going to keep reminding you that the story doesn't belong only to researchers with clipboards. It belongs to descendants too, and they are not extras in a plot about the past. Okay, with that said, let's zoom out and just feel the setting for a second. The Four Corners region is dramatic, but it's not dramatic in the way tourists sometimes expect. It's not constant spectacle, it's huge quiet. It's a long horizon, it's heat that can feel personal, and it's dryness that makes you notice every plant that managed to make a deal with the land. In an environment like that, water is never just water. It's time, it's planning, it's survival, it's politics. It's also community, because managing risk, agricultural risk, travel risk, storage risk, pushes people towards systems, shared labor, shared knowledge, shared rules, shared ritual. And when you're trying to understand Chaco, you have to be open to the possibility that what looks like an architectural mystery is really a social mystery. The big buildings are the most visible part, but the real story is how people organized themselves to make those buildings possible and what those buildings meant in the life of the region. One quick reality check. We're not talking about a single isolated group that popped up out of nowhere. We're talking about centuries of development with roots in earlier farming villages and traditions across the Southwest. What happens at Chaco is a kind of intensification, bigger structures, more standardized planning, more far-reaching connections. And that brings us to the central question we're going to keep circling, even when we zoom into details later. What was Chaco exactly? Was it a city in the way we use that word? Maybe not. Was it a ceremonial center, pulling people in for seasonal gatherings, pilgrimages, trade, weddings, alliances, and rituals? That's a strong possibility. Was it an administrative hub, with leaders coordinating labor and distributing goods? Some evidence points that way, too. Was it a social network made visible, where architecture was basically a form of communication, saying we're connected, we share this calendar, we share these ceremonies, we recognize this place as important? Again, possible. And here's the thing. It might be multiple of these at once, at different times for different groups. Humans are perfectly capable of building places that do more than one job. We do it all the time. Now, you might be wondering, if the evidence is mostly stone and debris and environmental data, why has this become such a famous mystery story? Part of it is the scale, sure. But part of it is that the story has a built-in twist. Because after all this building, after all this investment, Chaco's central role declines. People don't disappear, but the center of gravity shifts. The region reorganizes. Communities move, merge, split, and adapt. By the time you get into the 1200s, the map of major settlements looks different. And if you're standing in a monumental place like Pueblo Bonito, it's hard not to feel that as a question. Why would you leave this? Why would you stop coming here the way you used to? Why would you let the great houses quiet down? Some answers involve climate stress and drought. Some involve resource strain. Some involve conflict. Some involve social change, political change, religious change. And the honest answer is that no single lever probably explains it all. History is rarely that neat, but the evidence is good enough that we can do more than shrug. We can build a grounded narrative, one that respects uncertainty but doesn't hide behind it. That's what this lecture is going to do. Before we move into names and identities in the next chapter, let me leave you with one more observation from the visitor experience, because it actually matters. Chaco makes you aware of time in a physical way. In a modern city, we measure time with schedules and screens. In Chaco, time is the way shadows fall across stone. It's the way a wall holds heat after sunset. It's the way a building frames a horizon. You can feel that whoever designed these places cared about cycles, day and night, seasons, years, maybe even longer cycles. And that tells you something basic but profound. This wasn't just survival architecture. It wasn't just a roof over your head. It was meaning architecture. It was community architecture. It was memory architecture. And once you accept that, the mystery becomes less like a whodunit and more like a human story about how societies scale up, connect across distance, manage risk, and then, when conditions change, make hard decisions about where to place their future. So that's our starting line: a quiet canyon, massive stone complexes, no written chronicles to quote, and a question that refuses to go away. What kind of world was built here, and what really happened as that world transformed? Next, we deal with the first thing we have to get right before we go any further: what we even call the people who built this, and why that question is not just semantics. All right, before we get any deeper into roads and kivas and astronomy, we have to deal with a word that shows up everywhere, especially in older books and older TV specials: Anasazi. You've probably heard it, and a lot of people still use it casually, sometimes without even realizing it's controversial. So let's slow down and do this the clean way, because naming is not just a vocabulary issue, it's a relationship issue. Anasazi is a term that comes from Navajo, and you'll often see it translated along the lines of ancient enemies or ancestors of our enemies. Some translations vary and linguists will debate nuance, but the core point is simple. It's not a self-chosen name from the people we're talking about. It's an outsider label, and it carries an edge. So when modern Pueblo communities say, "Yeah, we don't love that," that's not political correctness, that's just basic respect. Imagine somebody else naming your grandparents something that basically frames them as the enemy. Even if it's historically complicated, it's not a neutral word. Now, to be fair, for a long time, archaeologists used Anasazi as a technical category, not as an insult. And you'll still run into it in museum labels, park brochures, academic titles, and especially older scholarship. But the direction of the field, and more importantly, the direction of respectful public history, has been moving toward Ancestral Puebloans. That's the common umbrella term you'll hear in most contemporary contexts, and it's meant to do two things. First, it avoids the baggage of the Navajo term, and second, it makes the continuity point up front. These were the ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples, not some unrelated vanished group, not a disconnected mystery tribe. Ancestors. That word matters. Now, I want to be careful even with Ancestral Puebloans because it's still a broad category created by researchers. It's useful, but it's not perfect. It bundles together diverse communities across a big region and a long timeline, and it can accidentally make people sound more uniform than they really were. The Southwest was and is a mosaic. So when we can be more specific, we should be. Hopi, Zuni, Keres, Tewa, Tiwa, Toa, the Rio Grande Pueblos, Acoma, Laguna, and others. Different languages, different histories, different traditions, sometimes different interpretations of the same places. In a lecture like this, where we're trying to tell a big regional story, we'll use Ancestral Puebloans as a practical umbrella, but we're going to keep reminding ourselves that umbrellas are not the same thing as skin. They're tools, not identities. Okay, so who were these people in the plainest sense? They were communities living across what's now the Four Corners region and beyond, developing over centuries into farmers, builders, potters, traders, astronomers, organizers, and, just as importantly, storytellers and ritual specialists, people whose knowledge systems didn't depend on alphabetic writing in the way Europeans later expected. And this is where I want to push back gently against an assumption many Americans carry, even unconsciously. The idea that if a society didn't leave behind written documents, it must have been somehow simpler. That's not how humans work. Complexity doesn't require paper. Complexity requires coordination, memory, teaching, and institutions. Sometimes those institutions are churches and courts and archives, and sometimes they're ceremonial calendars, clan systems, kinship networks, and oral histories that are structured, preserved, and transmitted with discipline. So, timeline. We're not going to turn this into a dense archaeology seminar, but we do need a basic map in time because without it, everything feels like it happened a long time ago, and that's not helpful. The deepest roots here go back thousands of years in terms of human presence, but when people talk about the direct ancestors of Pueblo societies, they're often talking about a shift toward more settled life and agriculture that becomes visible roughly around the first millennium AD, again, depending on the region. You'll sometimes hear the term basket maker for earlier phases. It's not a poetic term, it's basically a label archaeologists used because basketry shows up strongly and pottery comes later. Early on, we're talking about people who farmed but also hunted and gathered, living in smaller settlements, experimenting, adapting. Over time, those communities become more village-based. They refine maize agriculture, add beans and squash, develop pottery traditions, develop more permanent architecture, and you start to see more complex social organization. Then, as we move into the period that includes the rise of Chaco, roughly AD 900 to 1150 as the big Chaco inflorescence, though the roots begin earlier and the influence stretches later, you get this intensification, large planned buildings, regional connectivity, shared architectural and ceremonial patterns that spread over an area much larger than just the canyon itself. That's not a small jump. It implies leadership structures or ritual authority or both, plus the ability to mobilize labor over years and decades. And it implies something else too, a shared sense that certain places mattered enough to invest in them repeatedly, to return to them, to maintain them, to embed them into community life. Chaco becomes one of those places. But here's a key point that often gets lost. Chaco wasn't the only important place, and it wasn't the origin of Pueblo culture. It was more like a powerful node in a much bigger and older world. You can almost think of it like a cultural amplifier. It takes existing traditions, architecture, ceremony, regional exchange, and magnifies them into something monumental. And because it's monumental, it attracts our attention. We are a species that stares at big buildings. So when people say the Anasazi, it can sound like they're talking about one tribe or one nation centered on Chaco. That's misleading. The story is regional and it's long. Another thing to clear up, the term Pueblo itself, that's a Spanish word. It means village or town. The Spanish applied it to the communities they encountered in the Southwest because they saw settled villages. So even Pueblo is an outsider term originally, but it's a term many communities use today in English-language contexts, and it's embedded in modern political and cultural identity. Still, it's worth remembering that many of the words we use here are layered. Spanish colonial labels, Navajo terms, English academic categories, all sitting on top of native identities that existed long before any of those languages arrived. So if you ever feel like the vocabulary is messy, that's because history is messy. Language carries history like fingerprints. Now, there's another reason we're doing this chapter early, because the mystery framing can accidentally erase living people. If you call them Anasazi and then you say they disappeared, you've basically told a ghost story where you shouldn't. You've turned a history of migration, adaptation, and continuity into a spooky vanishing act. And that's not only inaccurate, it's disrespectful. Modern Pueblo communities have their own origin histories and migration histories tied to places like Chaco and Mesa Verde. Not everybody will tell those stories publicly, and not every detail is for outsiders. But the big picture is not up for debate. These are ancestor places. That changes how we should talk about them. It also changes how we should imagine the people themselves, not as props in a mystery box, but as humans making choices within constraints. Now, let me speak to a common question I get whenever I teach this material. So what did they call themselves? And the honest answer is, we don't have a single neat label preserved in a written document the way we do for, say, Romans or Athenians. Different communities likely had different names, and names could change with time, place, language, and social context. That's normal. Even today, people have multiple identities depending on who's asking and why. What we can say is that modern descendant communities have their own names and their own language terms that connect identity, place, and origin. In public scholarship, rather than guessing a single ancient self-name, we use careful umbrella terms, and then, when possible, we follow the lead of descendant communities about what language is appropriate. That's why you'll see museums and parks updating signage over the last couple decades. It's not a fad, it's an ethical correction. Okay, with the naming groundwork laid, let's do a quick human portrait that goes beyond labels. These were farming societies in a dry land, which means risk management was a major part of life. You plant, you watch the sky, you store, you share, you trade, you build relationships that can carry you through bad years. Architecture becomes part of that. Ceremony becomes part of that. Exchange networks become part of that. If you're living where rainfall can swing and the growing season can punish you, the social fabric matters as much as the soil. And it's in that context that we start to see the things that will later define the Chaco story. Communities building not just homes, but shared spaces, plazas, kivas, great houses, structures that make it easier to gather people, coordinate labor, and create a sense of belonging to something bigger than a single household. And I want to underline something else. Ancestral Pueblos were not a single political unit. Think of them as many communities with overlapping traditions, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, sometimes merging, sometimes splitting. The archaeological record shows both continuity and change. Pottery styles evolve, building techniques evolve, settlement patterns shift. You get moments of aggregation where people cluster and moments of dispersal where they spread out. That's not a sign of confusion, it's a sign of adaptation. So if we're honest, part of what makes Chaco so compelling is that it represents one of those aggregation moments at a massive scale, and we're still trying to understand what social mechanism made it work for as long as it did. Was it political authority? Was it religious authority? Was it a system of pilgrimage and ceremony? Was it a mix, changing over time? We'll get into that. But names are where we start, because names frame the questions we ask. If you call it the Anasazi mystery, you're already leaning toward they were strangers and they vanished. If you call it ancestral Puebloan history, you're leaning toward continuity, toward human decisions, toward relationships between past and present. That framing doesn't kill the mystery, it makes the mystery smarter. It turns it into a real historical question. How did a set of Puebloan communities build a regional center like Chaco? What did it mean to them, and how did the region reorganize when conditions changed? That's where we're headed. Next chapter, we stop talking about labels and we walk right into the canyon's biggest argument made of stone, Chaco itself. Not as a single ruin you take a picture of, but as a regional capital, whether political, ceremonial, or both, built in a place that seems at first glance like the last place you'd pick for something so ambitious. So let's do the thing everyone wants to do when they hear Chaco Canyon. Let's walk straight up to the big stuff, and ask what we're actually looking at, because the photos never quite prepare you for the scale in person, and they also don't prepare you for how intentional it feels. Chaco isn't a scatter of old walls. It's not a handful of cabins that happen to survive. It's architecture that looks like it expected an audience. Architecture that expected people to keep showing up year after year, generation after generation. The term you'll hear in archaeology is great house, and it sounds kind of generic until you realize what it means here. Massive multi-room complexes built with careful masonry, often multiple stories tall, arranged around plazas, tied to ceremonial spaces, and repeated across a regional network. And right in the center of this story, like the headline building, the one that has become almost synonymous with Chaco, is Pueblo Bonito. Pueblo Bonito is the big D-shaped complex you've seen in documentaries, the one that looks like it's hugging a plaza. It's not one big open hall, it's hundreds of rooms constructed in phases over a long span of time. Some rooms look like domestic spaces, others look like storage, some might have been used for specialized activities, and some parts feel almost like they were built to impress. And that's the first tension you have to sit with. Pueblo Bonito looks like it could be housing, like an apartment building, and people love to say things like, it was the biggest apartment building in North America. But that line is a little too neat. It makes it sound like a modern city block full of everyday renters, and the evidence doesn't really support that as the whole story. Sure, people lived here at times, but a lot of researchers think many great houses weren't densely occupied in the way you'd expect if the main purpose was just housing. There are rooms that look like storage, there's evidence of special deposits, there are burials in some places that look like they carried high status, there are exotic items that hint at far-reaching connections. And when you put that together, Pueblo Bonito starts to look less like a basic neighborhood and more like a place with power and ceremony built into its bones. Now, if Pueblo Bonito were the only impressive thing in the canyon, we'd still be interested. But the bigger point is that it's part of an entire designed landscape. There are multiple great houses in and around Chaco Canyon, Chetro Kettle, Pueblo del Arroyo, Una Vida, Hungo Pavi, and others. And they're not random, they share patterns. They often line up with each other visually or spatially. They're associated with great kivas, those huge circular structures that could hold gatherings and ceremonies. And the canyon itself becomes a kind of stage, a wide wash, low vegetation, the cliffs and mesas acting like natural walls, the horizon like a calendar. When people call Chaco a capital, they're not claiming it was a capital in the modern nation-state sense, like it had a president and taxes and a standing army. That's not what we mean. We mean it was a regional center, a place that pulled in resources, attention, and people from a huge area. It had gravity. It had influence. It had, to use a modern word that's surprisingly useful here, branding. If you built a great house out in a distant community that followed Chacoan patterns, you were kind of signaling something. We're connected, we're aligned, we're part of this larger world. And that leads us to the question that makes Chaco so hard to explain in a single sentence. What kind of center was it? A city? A ceremonial pilgrimage hub? An administrative node? A place where elites lived? A place where people gathered seasonally? The honest answer might be yes, and also it probably changed over time. But whatever it was, it required organization at a scale that should make you blink, because the desert doesn't give you extra credit for ambition. The desert charges you for it. Think about the material basics for a second. Stone you can find locally, sure, but shaping and stacking it in consistent, stable walls is skilled labor, and it takes time. Then there's timber. This is a canyon with limited big trees, yet Chacoan great houses used lots of wooden beams, vigas, supporting ceilings and upper floors. Where does that wood come from? It comes from mountain ranges at some distance. That means people had to travel out, cut large timbers, strip them, haul them back, and do it enough times to supply repeated building phases. No trucks, no horses in that pre-contact context, human labor. That's not just a construction problem, that's a social problem. You need people willing to do that work, and you need a reason strong enough that they keep doing it. The reason could be practical. Maybe these buildings were central storage and redistribution hubs. The reason could be political, leaders organizing labor to build visible power. The reason could be religious, ceremonial obligation, pilgrimage, the idea that building and maintaining this place is part of keeping the world in balance. Or, more realistically, it's some mix. Human societies rarely separate religion, politics, and economics the way modern Americans like to pretend we do. And even we don't actually separate them that cleanly if we're being honest. Another thing that makes Chaco feel like a capital is the planning quality. When you look at Chacoan masonry, especially in the classic periods, you see what archaeologists call core and veneer construction, an outer facing of shaped stones with a rubble core, producing thick, stable walls. You see patterned stonework in some places, almost decorative banding, which again suggests this isn't only functional. You also see repeated orientations and alignments that imply builders were working from shared rules, shared knowledge, maybe shared specialists. And then on top of that, you have the public spaces. Plazas matter. Great kivas matter. Those aren't private living rooms. Those are community-scale spaces, the kind of spaces that only make sense if you expect groups to gather, sometimes big groups. So, when we say Chaco Canyon, a regional capital, we're really talking about a place that concentrated people and meaning, and that concentration is the clue. Concentration doesn't happen for free. Concentration happens because there's something there that people value, fear, respect, need, or are obligated to support. Okay, so what did Chaco do for the region? Here's one way to think about it, and I'm going to say this like a journalist, not like a textbook. Chaco might have been a kind of engine for regional unity, a place that stitched communities together through ceremony, exchange, and shared schedules. We know communities across a wide area built or remodeled buildings in a Chacoan style. We know some goods moved long distances. We know the canyon had moments where it seems to have been a hub. The simplest story is that Chaco provided a common reference point, like a big annual gathering place, where people came not only to trade goods, but also to renew alliances, marry, settle disputes, participate in rituals, and basically keep the social fabric from fraying in a tough environment. If that's the case, then the great houses aren't apartments, they're infrastructure for a system. Storage, lodging for visiting groups or specialists, spaces for ritual preparation, places that anchor identity. Another story, not mutually exclusive, is that Chaco represents a form of hierarchy, some people having more authority, more access to prestige goods, more ability to command labor. There's evidence that gets used in these arguments, certain burials, certain concentrations of wealth items, the scale of coordinated construction. And I want to be careful here because hierarchy is one of those words that can make people imagine kings and palaces. It might have been subtler: religious authority, clan leadership, ritual specialists who had the calendar knowledge, the ability to say when ceremonies should happen, when planting should happen, when people should gather. In a world where timing can make the difference between a successful harvest and a disaster, calendar knowledge is power. You don't need a crown for that to matter. You just need everyone to agree that you're the person or the group who knows. Now, let's talk Pueblo Bonito specifically for a minute, because it's so iconic and it's also so misunderstood. One of the strange things about Pueblo Bonito is that it contains huge numbers of rooms, but not all the rooms look like they were lived in at the same time, and some rooms are tiny, like storage. That has led researchers to propose that Pueblo Bonito functioned partly as a storage and ceremonial complex, not simply as a residential block. There are kivas embedded in the structure, and the relationship between private rooms and ceremonial spaces is one of the tells. And then you have the overall form, this big curved wall, a strong sense of enclosure around a plaza. Again, it feels like design with a public audience. Another key factor is time depth. Pueblo Bonito wasn't built in one go. It was built and remodeled and expanded over generations. That matters because it means Chaco wasn't a short-lived boom town. It was sustained. And if a place is sustained, people have stories about it. They have obligations around it. They have reasons to keep coming back. So even if we can't read a written charter, the building itself is acting like a record. It's basically saying, this place kept mattering. Now, the environment again, because the environment is always the silent character in this story. Chaco sits in a dry land where farming depends on rainfall patterns, runoff, water control, and risk management. People grew maize, beans, squash, those classic trio crops, and they used strategies suited to arid conditions, placing fields in areas that caught runoff, using check dams, managing small-scale irrigation in some contexts, and storing food when times were good. A place like Chaco, if it drew people in, would have needed systems for food storage and distribution, especially during gatherings. And food storage is another one of those things that becomes political without anyone having to declare it political. If you can store surplus and organize distribution, you can stabilize communities in bad years, but you can also create dependency. The difference between mutual aid and control can be thin, and archaeology doesn't always tell you which side of that line a society leaned toward. It might have leaned both ways at different times. Another element of capitalness is standardization and messaging across distance. In the modern world, capitals send out laws, taxes, and official documents. In Chaco's world, a message might be architectural style, ceremonial timing, shared roadways, shared plaza layouts, shared kiva forms, physical and ritual templates that communities recognized. If you're a family living in a distant settlement and you see a great house built in Chacoan style, that might tell you this community is plugged into the Chaco network. And that network could mean access to goods, access to knowledge, access to alliances, access to ritual legitimacy. It could also mean obligations, labor, tribute, participation. That's how networks work. They give and they take. And here's the part that I think is crucial for a US audience. You don't need writing to run a system like that if your system is built on repeated gatherings, shared calendars, and social obligations that are memorized and enforced through community pressure and ritual. If you've ever been part of a tight-knit community, religious, immigrant, rural, military, even just a big extended family, you know how much gets organized without paperwork. Now multiply that by centuries and add architecture that physically encodes the calendar. You start to see how a place like Chaco could function as a center. Let's also address something that always comes up: population. People want a clean number. How many people lived at Chaco? And the truth is, it depends on what you mean by lived. Permanent residents at any given time might have been relatively limited compared to the size of the buildings, while the population could swell during gatherings or seasonal events. Some researchers propose Chaco operated like a pilgrimage center, small core population, large periodic influx. Others emphasize broader residential use. The evidence is debated, and that's okay. In fact, it's part of what makes Chaco intellectually honest. It refuses to fit perfectly into our modern categories. It's not a pure city. It's not a pure temple complex. It's not a pure village. It's a hybrid, and the hybrid may be the whole point. Okay, so if Chaco is a regional capital, what's the regional map? It extends beyond the canyon. Great houses appear across a wide area of the San Juan Basin and beyond, and Chaco seems to have had influence, direct or indirect, far from the canyon floor. That's why Chaco is not just an archaeological site, it's a phenomenon. It's the visible center of a regional pattern. And that pattern includes things we're going to spend serious time on later: the roads, the long-distance materials, the astronomy, and the eventual reorganization when climate and society start putting pressure on the system. But before we race ahead, I want you to sit with one more thought. Chaco is a bet. It's a bet that organizing a region around shared centers and shared practices is worth the cost. It's a bet that you can concentrate labor and resources, and that the payoff, social stability, ritual legitimacy, access to goods, mutual support, will be there when you need it. And for a while, it seems like the bet worked. The buildings went up, the network existed, the place mattered. The question we're going to keep asking is not, how could they do it? Because the answer to that is, they did it the way humans do hard things, together, over time. The deeper question is, what kind of agreement made it possible? And agreements can be sacred, they can be political, they can be economic. They can be all of them, woven into each other so tightly you can't separate the strands. Chaco Canyon, at its height, looks like a society that found a powerful way to weave those strands into stone. Next chapter, we're going to follow one of the strongest clues that Chaco was bigger than the canyon: the network itself, the straight roads, the imported timber, the long-distance goods. And we're going to ask the really fun question: were these roads built to move stuff, to move people, to move ideas, or to move power? Okay, so here's where the story starts to feel almost unreal in a very specific way. You can stand in Chaco Canyon, look out at the terrain, and your eyes immediately do what human eyes always do. They look for the practical route. You look for the easiest slope, the natural pass, the wash that's basically already a path. And then you learn about the Chaco roads, these long, engineered routes that sometimes run remarkably straight, even when the land is telling you politely to curve around. And you think, wait, why would anyone build a road like that out here? What were they trying to do? That question about purpose is a huge chunk of the Chaco mystery, because roads are never just roads. Roads tell you what matters. Roads tell you who has the power to organize labor. Roads tell you whether people are thinking small, like get from A to B, or thinking big, like connect a world. The Chaco road system is not one tidy highway map, but archaeologists have identified multiple segments and traces, some wide, some formal, some more ambiguous, radiating out from the canyon and linking great houses and outlier communities. In some places, these routes are so straight and so broad that they look like statements. And that's why, from the beginning, people have argued about what they were for. Were they built for commerce, for hauling goods like timber and pottery and food? Were they pilgrimage routes, ceremonial pathways used during gatherings? Were they political, like a way of projecting Chaco's importance into the landscape? Or were they some combination, changing over time, used differently by different groups? I'm going to keep giving you that combination answer a lot in this series, not because I'm trying to dodge, but because human societies reuse infrastructure all the time. Think about modern roads. They carry groceries and commuters and military convoys and funeral processions and parade floats. The same asphalt, different meanings. So let's look at three big pieces of the network story: timber, turquoise, and those weirdly straight roads. Start with timber because it's the most concrete "how did they do this" puzzle. Chaco and great houses used thousands of wooden beams over time, and the canyon itself is not a forest. So where does the wood come from? From higher elevation mountain ranges, places with big conifers, some distance away. That means Chaco is importing heavy construction material from far outside its immediate environment. And again, no wagons, no draft animals in that period, no metal saws. It's human muscle, planning, and persistence. Timber procurement is basically logistics. It's also a social signal. If you can coordinate timber hauling, you can coordinate people. And if you can coordinate people, you've got a system. Now, there are different ways to imagine that system. One is centralized. Chaco leaders or ritual authorities organizing work crews, sending people out, scheduling expeditions, managing storage. Another is more distributed. Partner communities bringing timber as part of alliance obligations, or as contributions to ceremonies, or as prestige gifts. There's also a hybrid possibility. Some timber moved through formal coordination, some through reciprocal relationships. The key takeaway isn't just they carried wood. The key takeaway is that Chaco's architecture is physically built out of regional connectivity. Every beam is a receipt that says we are not isolated. Now let's talk turquoise, because turquoise is one of those materials that keeps showing up in the Chaco story like a recurring character. Turquoise was valued across the Southwest, and it shows up at Chaco in quantity. It's used in ornaments, beads, inlays, and ritual contexts. And the turquoise story matters for two reasons. First, it's evidence of exchange and value systems. People wanted it, people moved it, people shaped it. Second, it connects Chaco to broader southwestern cultural worlds where turquoise had meaning beyond decoration. It's not just jewelry, it's identity, prestige, ritual. If Chaco is a hub where turquoise concentrates, that suggests Chaco is plugged into networks of acquisition and distribution, which again points toward regional influence. And while we're on trade and long-distance connections, this is the spot where the story gets spicy in a way that makes YouTube audiences lean forward. There's evidence that some goods at Chaco came from far to the south. Think exotic birds like macaws and traces of cacao in certain contexts. Those aren't local, those are links. And whether those links were direct trade routes, down-the-line exchange through many hands, or rare prestige imports, they tell you the same basic thing. Chaco was not living in a bubble. Chaco was part of a world that stretched a long way. And when you picture that world, it changes the emotional vibe of the place. It stops being a desert mystery site and starts being a node in a continent-scale conversation. Okay, now the roads, because the roads are the part that makes people argue. Archaeologists have mapped road segments that radiate from Chaco and connect to outlier great houses, massive buildings built in Chacoan style but located far from the canyon. Some road segments appear to run straight for miles, some are unusually wide, some have berms or edging. In some places, you can see stairways cut into rock where roads climb a mesa. That's labor. That's intention. And roads like this raise a question that's not even about archaeology at first. It's just about human behavior. Would you do that if all you needed was a convenient path? Probably not. If your only goal is to move from point A to point B efficiently, you let the land guide you. You follow water courses. You follow ridge lines. You take the easiest grade. You don't bulldoze a straight line across difficult terrain unless the straight line itself matters. Which leads to one of the most compelling interpretations. These roads might have been ceremonial. They might have been processional routes used for pilgrimages or ritual movement, where the act of walking the road mattered, where the straightness carried symbolic weight, like pointing to a place, aligning with a direction, connecting a community to a center in a way that's visual and physical. In that interpretation, roads are not just infrastructure, they're ideology made visible. But then there's the practical argument. You can't ignore that people had to move goods, timber, pottery, food, raw materials, maybe even people relocating. So surely some of these roads were used for transport. And the reality could be that the roads started as one thing and became another, or that different segments had different functions. Some could be heavily used routes, others could be more symbolic lines laid into the land as a kind of claim or connection. Another angle that's worth mentioning is political signaling. If Chaco was a regional center, building roads out into the landscape is a way of saying, this is our world, our network, our order. You see similar patterns in empires that build roads, even when roads aren't strictly necessary. Roads are about control, yes, but they're also about identity. Who belongs, who's connected, who's inside the system. Now, if you're thinking, okay, roads and trade and timber and turquoise, this is starting to sound like an empire, let's slow down. Chaco is not Rome. We don't have evidence for armies marching, conquest inscriptions, or a bureaucratic state in the classic imperial sense. But we also don't need armies for a system to be influential. Influence can be ritual, prestige, alliance, marriage networks, shared religion, shared calendar knowledge. In fact, sometimes ritual and prestige are more effective than violence because they make participation feel voluntary, even when obligations are real. That's why Chaco is so hard to label. It could be a kind of soft power center, controlling the flow of meaning and legitimacy rather than controlling territory with soldiers. And that's not me being poetic. It's a useful analytical frame. Think about modern cultural capitals. A city can be powerful because it sets the style, the standards, the calendar, without controlling anyone at gunpoint. Now zoom back to a world where ceremony and cosmology are central, and you can imagine how a place like Chaco might exert gravity. Let me give you a concrete example of how archaeologists think about this. They look at outlier great houses, big Chaco-style buildings scattered across the region, and they ask, are these independent communities copying a prestigious style, like small towns copying the architecture of a famous capital, or are these outliers more like stations in a coordinated network, built with some level of central planning or shared specialist knowledge? The answer might be both. Some outliers could represent local adoption, others could represent tighter integration. Either way, the pattern suggests that Chaco's influence wasn't confined to the canyon floor. It extended outward, which makes the canyon's decline later even more important, because when a hub declines, the whole network shifts. Another detail that matters here is the rhythm of gatherings. If Chaco functioned as a ceremonial center, then roads make even more sense. People would travel along known routes to reach the canyon for major events tied to agricultural cycles or astronomical observations. They would bring goods, they would bring stories, they would exchange partners in marriage alliances, they would renew obligations. Then they'd go home, carrying the influence outward again. That's a living network. And if you're thinking, but wouldn't we see more stuff along the roads? Sometimes we do, but roads don't always leave a clean archaeological footprint of artifacts the way a settlement does. A path can be heavily used and still be quiet in material remains, especially if people are careful with what they drop and if the environment erodes and reworks the surface over centuries. So the lack of roadside trash is not proof of no use, it just means we have to be cautious. Now, a quick word on how these roads were found, because it's kind of a modern twist to an ancient story. Some road traces are visible on the ground, but a lot of the system became clearer through aerial photography and later remote sensing. That's a reminder that archaeology isn't just people with trowels, it's also people with maps, satellites, and a lot of patience. And it's also a reminder that what looks like empty desert can still be structured by human intention in ways you don't notice until you change your perspective. Okay, so what does this chapter do for our overall mystery? It changes the stakes. If Chaco were just one impressive canyon site, the mystery would be limited. How did they build it? Why did they leave? But once you see Chaco as the hub of a network, roads, timber procurement, prestige goods, outlier communities, the mystery expands. Now we have to ask, what held that network together? What made communities invest in a center? What made people accept shared patterns? And later, what made that system loosen or transform? Networks don't just stop because someone gets bored. Networks shift because conditions change: environmental, social, political, spiritual. And Chaco's network, whatever its exact nature, was expensive. It required ongoing work. That means it required ongoing belief in the system. So keep that in mind, because it's going to echo through everything we do next. Also, and this is important, networks are not always benevolent. We like to romanticize exchange and connection, but networks can create inequality. They can concentrate wealth and prestige. They can amplify the power of certain groups. They can create tensions between those who are close to the center and those who are on the edge. So when we talk about Chaco's reach, we should also be open to the possibility that not everyone experienced the Chaco world the same way. For some, it might have meant opportunity, identity, and support. For others, it might have meant obligation and pressure. Archaeology can't always tell us whose experience was which, but the possibility is worth holding because it makes the later period of reorganization feel less like a sudden tragedy and more like a complex social shift. All right, we've now got a canyon that looks like a capital and a regional network that looks like intentional connectivity. The next clue we follow is the one that makes Chaco feel almost eerily precise: the sky. Because once you start paying attention to how these buildings and landscapes line up with solar and lunar cycles, it becomes hard to deny that astronomy, or at least very serious sky watching, was a key part of how this world was organized. Next chapter, we go upward: alignments, calendars, and that famous feature at Fajada Butte that people call the sun dagger, which is one of the coolest examples of science built into stone anywhere in North America. Let me start this chapter with a confession. If you're the kind of person who rolls their eyes when someone says ancient astronomy, I get it, because the internet has trained us to expect nonsense. Crystals, prophecies, people claiming every rock alignment is a UFO runway. But Chaco is not that kind of story. Chaco is the kind of story where, if you pay attention and you stay disciplined about evidence, you end up more impressed than you expected to be, and also a little humbled, because you realize how much careful observation you can do without telescopes, without computers, without anything modern except patience and a good memory. The basic idea is simple. Many Chacoan buildings and features show alignments with the sky, sunrise and sunset at key times of year, and in some cases, more complicated cycles tied to the moon. And once you see that, the canyon starts to feel less like a bunch of big buildings and more like a place that was tuned, like an instrument, to time. Not time on a wristwatch, time as a pattern you can see in light and shadow. Time as a schedule for farming, ceremony, travel, and social life. Now, why would sky knowledge matter so much? In an arid farming world, timing is everything. Plant too early, you risk frost or wasted moisture. Plant too late, you miss the season. Harvest timing matters, storage timing matters. And beyond farming, ceremonial cycles often track seasons in ways that keep communities coordinated. So astronomy here isn't science for science's sake. It's practical and social. It's a calendar that helps a region move together. And in a network like Chaco, where people may have been gathering and dispersing and reconnecting, shared timing is a kind of glue. Okay, let's talk about the sun first, because that's the easiest to picture. The sun doesn't rise in the exact same spot every day. Over the year, its rising and setting points slide along the horizon. At the solstices, around late June and late December, you hit the extremes. At the equinoxes, around March and September, you get the middle point. People who watch the horizon carefully can mark these shifts with astonishing accuracy, and you don't need math symbols to do it. You need a stable viewpoint and repeated observation over many years. In Chaco, researchers have argued that the orientations of certain walls, doorways, and building axes align with solar events. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's obvious once you know what you're looking for. And it makes sense. If you're building monumental architecture meant to last, you can embed a calendar into it. You can make a building that helps you know when a season is turning, or when a major ceremony is due, or when a time of travel and gathering is appropriate. And then you bring in the moon, and that's where it gets really interesting, because the moon's long-term cycle is harder to track. The sun gives you an annual rhythm. The moon gives you a monthly rhythm, but it also has a much longer pattern called the lunar standstill cycle. Over about 18.6 years, the moon's rising and setting points reach maximum and minimum extremes on the horizon. Those are the major and minor lunar standstills. If you're tracking that cycle, you're doing long-term community observation. You're passing knowledge from one generation to the next. You're saying, we're going to watch this for decades and build memory around it. That kind of timekeeping is not casual. It implies specialists, or at least structured tradition, people responsible for watching, remembering, teaching, and using the information. Now, I want to be honest. Not every proposed lunar alignment in Chaco is universally accepted. Archaeologists argue about which alignments are intentional, which are coincidental, and which are overstated. That's normal. The sky is big, the landscape has many lines, and humans are pattern-finding machines. So the responsible approach is treat alignments as a hypothesis supported by repeated patterns, contextual evidence, and consistency across sites, not as a magical claim you can make from one photo. But even with caution, the Chaco record has enough to say, yes, sky watching mattered, and it probably mattered a lot. Now, the famous centerpiece of this conversation is on Fajada Butte, the prominent landform in Chaco Canyon that rises above the surrounding landscape like a natural monument. If you've seen the images, you know the vibe. a narrow shaft of sunlight forming a line, moving across rock carvings in a way that looks almost engineered. This is what people call the sun dagger. The basic description is that at certain times, especially around the solstices, a beam of sunlight passes through the gaps between slabs of rock and creates a sharp line of light that interacts with spiral petroglyphs on the rock face. At one solstice, it may slice through the center of a spiral. At the other, it may bracket it. The effect is dramatic, and it feels like a literal calendar built into stone and light. And here's the thing, even if you're skeptical, even if you try to keep your cool, you can't look at it and not feel that someone understood the relationship between sun, shadow, and season. The strongest, most careful interpretations treat it as a sophisticated horizon and light marker that could have helped track solstices and possibly other events. Now, we also have to add a modern chapter to that story, because the sun dagger isn't just a cool ancient feature, it's a fragile one. Increased visitation, people climbing, walking, being near the site, contributed to erosion and instability. There were concerns about the rock slabs shifting, about the site being damaged. As a result, access was restricted and the site was closed to protect it. And I like mentioning that in a lecture because it snaps people out of the fantasy that ancient sites are frozen in time. They're not. They're changing constantly. They're threatened by weather, by human traffic, by time itself. So the sun dagger becomes a lesson in two directions. It shows you how precise ancient observation could be, and it shows you how easily that evidence can be altered or lost. Now, zooming back out from that one famous feature, the broader point is that Chaco's architecture seems to care about the horizon. When you build in a canyon, you're surrounded by a dramatic horizon line, cliffs, mesas, notches, distant peaks. Those features can act like markers. If the sun rises in a notch on a particular day, you can use that. If a wall or doorway frames that notch, you've turned architecture into a measuring tool. And again, this isn't weird. This is the most human thing in the world. People everywhere have watched the sky and used the horizon as a calendar. What's notable at Chaco is that the calendar seems to be part of monumental planning, not just casual observation. It's integrated into the built environment of a regional center. And if Chaco was a place where people gathered, then a shared calendar isn't just useful, it's powerful. Because if you control the calendar, or if you host the calendar, you host the rhythm of social life. You're the place where time is confirmed. You're the place where ceremonies are anchored. You're the place that says, now. Think about how much social power is contained in scheduling even today. Whoever sets the calendar often sets the priorities. Now imagine that in a society where timing is tied not only to work, but to spiritual balance and communal identity. It's not hard to see how sky knowledge could sit at the center of authority. Here's another angle that helps a modern American audience understand what's going on. Don't picture astronomy as a separate science department. Picture it as part of governance, part of religion, part of agriculture, part of education. The people who knew the sky, how to read it, how to predict seasonal turning points, would be valuable. They might be ritual leaders. They might be advisors. They might be the people who say when to plant, when to gather, when to travel, when to hold major ceremonies that keep relationships intact across the region. And that makes the Chaco story less mysterious in the supernatural sense and more mysterious in the social sense. How was knowledge organized? How was it transmitted? How was it trusted? What institutions existed to preserve it? You don't need written textbooks for that. You need repetition and responsibility. You need teaching structures, apprenticeship, clan roles, ceremonial roles, community memory. Now, I also want to address a temptation people have when they hear this material. They want to jump straight to, so they had an observatory.
And maybe in a loose sense they did. Many cultures have observation points, but if you picture a modern observatory dome, you're going to miss the point. The instrument here is the landscape and the architecture together. The horizon is the dial, the sun and moon are the hands, and buildings are the frame that helps you read it consistently. That's why when you're standing in Chaco, the sky feels unusually present. It's not just background, it's part of the design language. Another thing worth saying out loud, a calendar doesn't only tell you when it's time to plant, it tells you when it's time to gather. And that matters a lot for networks.
This chapter is about timing the movement. Roads without a calendar are just lines. Roads with a calendar become a system. People can converge, people can coordinate trade, people can coordinate rituals, people can schedule construction, food preparation, storage distribution. And if you're thinking, that sounds like administration, you're not wrong. It's administration through ceremony and shared timekeeping rather than paperwork. That's a theme we're going to keep coming back to, especially when we talk about why the system changes later on. Because when systems break down, it's often not just because the environment gets harsh, it's because the social agreements that held coordination together start to strain. Calendars are agreements. Shared timing is an agreement. If people stop trusting the center, or if the center can't deliver stability, the agreement gets renegotiated. Now, quick caution again, because I don't want to overclaim. Chaco's astronomical interpretation has gone through waves. Early researchers sometimes made bold claims. Later researchers pushed back, emphasizing the risk of seeing patterns everywhere. The current responsible stance, broadly speaking, is that there are strong cases for intentional solar alignments and plausible cases for lunar considerations, and the overall pattern suggests that sky observation was integrated into Chacoan planning and ritual life. But we should avoid turning every alignment into certainty. If you're listening to this and you want a simple takeaway, it's this. The builders of Chaco were paying attention to the sky in a structured, repeatable way, and they built in ways that suggest timing mattered deeply to how their society functioned. That's the meaningful claim, and it's solid. Now let me connect this back to the emotional core of the mystery. People ask, why would you build a capital in a harsh canyon, and why would people keep coming? The sky piece gives you a partial answer. If Chaco was a kind of ceremonial timekeeper, a place that anchored the calendar, then it's not just a location, it's a service, it's a function, it's a shared reference point for a region. And once you think of it that way, the stone and roads start to look less like a random obsession and more like infrastructure for a worldview where humans have obligations to each other and to the cycles that keep life possible, and where those obligations are enacted through gathering, building, and ritual. That doesn't mean everyone experienced it the same way. Some people likely loved the gatherings. Some probably resented the obligations. Some benefited more than others. But the calendar would have touched everyone because everyone eats, everyone plants, everyone depends on seasons. So the sky becomes a common language, and that common language can unify a region until it can't. So here's where we land this chapter. Chaco is not just stone and roads. It's time. It's a regional center that seems to have encoded time into architecture and landscape. The sun dagger is the flashy example, but the deeper story is a society that was serious about cycles, serious about coordination, and serious about building a world that reflected that seriousness. Next, we're going to come back down from the sky and ask a more intimate question, one that people rarely get right because the big monuments distract us. What was life actually like in and around the great houses? Who lived there? Who visited? Who worked? Who stored food? Who made pottery? Who cared for children? Who organized ceremonies?
And how do we even begin to answer those questions when the record is mostly stone, soil, and fragments?
Let's bring it down to human scale for a minute, because Chaco can mess with your head. You spend all this time staring at walls and plazas and alignments, and you start thinking in these big abstract terms, networks, centers, systems, and then you remember the obvious. Real people woke up here, got hungry here, argued here, raised kids here, hauled water here, fixed roofs here. And if we don't talk about daily life, we end up turning Chaco into a monument without humans, which is basically the oldest mistake in archaeology storytelling. So what do we actually know about life in and around the great houses, and what are we still guessing at? First, the big question: did people live in the great houses the way we imagine people living in a large residential building? The answer is sometimes yes, but probably not in a simple, everyone lived here all the time way. A lot of rooms in many great houses are small and look like storage rather than living space. Fireplaces, cooking debris, and other signs of domestic activity aren't evenly distributed the way you'd expect if every room was part of normal home life. That has led many researchers to think the great houses had mixed functions, some residential use, some storage, some ritual, some hosting of visitors or specialists. And I like that interpretation because it makes Chaco feel more realistic. Centers are usually multi-purpose. Think about a courthouse or a church complex or a university campus. People are there for different reasons at different times. The building is one thing, the human uses are many things. So if not everyone was living inside Pueblo Bonito full-time, who was? One possibility is a smaller resident population, families or groups with special roles, plus periodic influxes of visitors during ceremonies and gatherings. Another possibility is that occupation shifted over time, some phases more residential, other phases more administrative or ceremonial. And there's also the uncomfortable but plausible idea that some parts of the great houses were associated with higher status. When you see certain burials and concentrations of prestige goods in particular locations, it raises the question of inequality. Not modern class inequality in a simple sense, but social ranking, some people having more authority or more access. Chaco may have been a world where leadership existed, whether political, ritual, or both. And daily life under leadership feels different than daily life in a flat, egalitarian village. It affects labor, storage, and obligation. Now, what did people eat? The core crops in the Pueblo world are often summarized as corn, beans, and squash, and that's not wrong, but it's a little too neat. Maize was central. Beans add protein and fix nitrogen in the soil. Squash provides calories and storage potential. People also gathered wild plants, seeds, nuts, fruits, depending on what was available, and hunted game. Turkeys become important in Pueblo contexts, both for food and for feathers. And because the environment is unpredictable, storage matters a lot. One of the themes of arid land farming is that you survive not just by producing food, but by buffering bad years with surplus storage and social support. That's where big storage capacity in great houses becomes interesting. If a great house can store a lot, it can stabilize a community during stress, but it can also become a point of control. Who gets access? Who decides distribution? Who contributes? Those are political questions, even if no one uses the word politics. Okay, so what did a normal day look like? We can't reconstruct a schedule minute by minute, but we can sketch a rhythm. People would have spent serious time on farming tasks, planting, tending, harvesting, plus maintenance work on fields and water management.
Water management here isn't necessarily giant canals. It's often small-scale strategies, using runoff, building check dams, placing fields strategically, making the most of rare storms. Then there's food processing. If you've ever processed corn by hand, you know it's work. Grinding grain takes time and muscle, and that labor tends to be repetitive and daily. There's also building maintenance. In a multi-story masonry structure, roofs and walls need care. Timber and plaster degrade, sand moves, weather matters. There's craft production, pottery, weaving, tool-making, carving, repairing. And there's social life, visiting, storytelling, teaching kids, negotiating relationships. People didn't live as isolated nuclear families. Kinship networks matter, clan identities matter, cooperation matters. Chaco, like many Puebloan societies, likely had strong social structures that organized who worked with whom, who married whom, who held ritual roles, who had responsibilities to which spaces and ceremonies. Now let's talk about kivas, because kivas are one of the clearest hints that daily life and ritual life were tightly linked. A kiva is typically a circular, semi-subterranean room used for ceremonies and community gatherings. Small kivas are common in Puebloan sites. Great kivas are huge and suggest large group events. If you have multiple kivas embedded in or near a great house, that tells you the building isn't just a pile of rooms, it's tied to ceremonial practice. And ceremonial practice isn't something you do on weekends. In many societies, ceremony is part of governance, education, social cohesion, even dispute resolution. It's where community identity is renewed. So when we imagine life in Chaco, we should imagine a world where ritual schedules shape work schedules, and where certain people have roles and responsibilities tied to those spaces. Another piece of daily life that's easy to miss is movement. People weren't just stuck in the canyon. They traveled, they visited outlier communities, they went to gather resources, they went to trade, they went to meet relatives. Even in a world without horses and cars, people covered serious distances on foot, especially if they had strong reasons: ceremony, alliance, exchange. That means Chaco's social world extended far beyond the rooms we see. The canyon was a node in a lived map of relationships. Now, what about conflict? I'm not going to jump ahead into the collapse chapter, but it matters even here. Daily life can include tension. Archaeology suggests that in some periods and places, violence increased in the broader region. That doesn't mean everyone lived in constant fear, but it does mean we shouldn't paint a pastel picture of perfect harmony. Complex societies have conflict over resources, over leadership, over obligations, over identity. If Chaco was a center that concentrated wealth or authority, it could attract resentment. And if climate stress hits, conflict gets more likely. So daily life might include not only work and ceremony, but also negotiation, caution, and social strain at times. Now, I want to highlight one more everyday reality that people rarely visualize: dirt. These places were dusty. Wind moves sand. Floors get gritty. Walls shed. Fire smoke builds up. Storage attracts pests. Kids run around. Dogs exist. Turkeys exist. People spill things. People fix things. The romance of ancient ruins disappears fast when you remember that these were not museum exhibits. They were living spaces. And that's important because it keeps us from treating Chaco as a mystical puzzle box. It makes it a human place again. So what's the key conclusion of this chapter? It's that the great houses were likely not just residential blocks and not just temples, but flexible, multi-purpose centers, part home, part storage facility, part ceremonial complex, part guest house, part symbol of connection to a wider world. Daily life was probably a mix of routine labor and periodic intensity, quiet weeks of farming and maintenance, then bursts of activity during gatherings, construction phases, or major ceremonies. And if that's true, it helps explain why Chaco could feel both populated and empty depending on the season and era. It could be a place that was sometimes crowded and loud, sometimes quiet and echoing, the way many pilgrimage or ceremonial centers are. Next chapter, we follow the story forward and outward to one of the most visually iconic shifts in the whole ancestral Puebloan world, the move into the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. We're going to talk about what changed, what pressures were building, and why people would choose to build homes tucked into rock alcoves high above canyon floors in a way that looks to us both brilliant and a little desperate. So now the story does something cinematic. For a while, we've been in Chaco, thinking about big open plazas, massive great houses on canyon floors, roads reaching outward, a center that feels like it's meant to gather people in. And then, as we move forward in time and shift our focus toward places like Mesa Verde, the architecture changes in a way you can feel in your stomach. Instead of building out in the open, people start building into the cliffs, tucked into alcoves, stacked in stone rooms under overhangs, sometimes hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. It's beautiful, honestly. It's also a little unsettling, because the first thought a modern person has is, okay, why are we hiding? And the truth is, there isn't one single answer that fits every site and every community, but there are strong pressures we can talk about, and they start to converge in the late 1100s into the 1200s, when the region is going through serious change. First, let's just clarify what Mesa Verde represents in this story. Mesa Verde is in present-day southwestern Colorado, and it's famous for some of the best-preserved cliff dwellings in North America, places like Cliff Palace, Balcony House, Spruce Tree House. When you see them, you can't avoid the human ingenuity, using natural rock shelters as roofs, building masonry rooms inside, designing access points, ladders, passageways. These weren't sloppy emergency hideouts, they were planned communities. People invested in them, which means they expected to be there long enough that it was worth building properly. And that's an important point because it pushes back against the simplistic idea that cliff dwellings equal panic. Sometimes moving to the edge can be defensive, sure, but it can also be strategic, social, even cultural. So let's walk through the major theories in a way that feels fair. One big category is defense and security. Archaeologists have pointed out that cliff dwellings can have limited access points. They can be easier to defend. If tensions and raiding increase in the region, living in an alcove with a controllable entry is attractive. Also, cliff dwellings have visibility. You can see the approaches, you can send signals, you can watch for movement. And the 1200s in the broader Southwest do show evidence that conflict increased in some areas. More fortification, more trauma on skeletons in some regions, more signs of communities clustering. So yes, defense is part of the conversation, but it's not the whole conversation, and if we make it the whole story, we turn Mesa Verde into a siege movie, which isn't responsible. Another category is climate and resource management. People didn't build cliff dwellings randomly. Alcoves can have practical advantages. They provide shade in summer and some shelter in winter. They can protect stored food from weather. They can reduce the wear and tear of precipitation on walls. They can be near water sources, springs, or runoff zones, depending on the local geography. And Mesa Verde as a landscape has its own agricultural possibilities.
Mesa tops, canyon bottoms, pockets of soil. People could farm in multiple microenvironments, spreading risk. In a period where rainfall is less reliable and drought episodes are more frequent, spreading risk is survival. So, moving into cliff alcoves could be part of a broader strategy. Use the mesa landscape in a diversified way. Place your homes where the environment gives you some protection, and keep your fields in varied spots. Another big category is social reorganization. This one is less visually obvious, but maybe more powerful. As pressures rise, climate stress, population shifts, competition, people often aggregate. They cluster into larger, more defensible, more socially coherent communities. Aggregation helps with defense, yes, but it also helps with cooperation. You can share labor, you can share water management, you can share storage, you can share ritual life, you can enforce social rules, and you can keep an eye on each other, which sounds creepy in modern language, but in small-scale farming societies, community accountability is often part of stability. Cliff dwellings might reflect that aggregation trend, communities pulling closer together, literally building homes side by side, creating more intense shared spaces. Now, an important timeline point. The cliff dwellings that people love to photograph are mostly a relatively late phenomenon, especially in their dramatic form. Earlier in the region, you have pit houses and surface pueblos, and then later you get these alcove communities. So we shouldn't imagine one sudden overnight move, like one day everyone woke up and said, "To the cliffs." It's more like a shifting pattern. Some families move, some stay. Some places become more important while others fade. People experiment. People respond to local conditions. By the time you hit the late 1200s, a lot of the big cliff dwellings are active, and then later many are abandoned as part of the broader regional migration story we'll cover in the next chapters. But in the middle of that arc, these sites represent a real, lived adaptation. Another thing, we shouldn't separate Chaco and Mesa Verde as if they're totally different worlds with no connection. The Chaco and Peak is earlier, and Mesa Verde's dramatic cliff phase is later. But cultural continuities exist across the region. Architecture techniques, pottery traditions, ceremonial patterns. Also, people move, ideas move, families have ties across distance. So the shift toward cliff dwellings can be seen as part of the broader regional story of recentering after Chaco's influence declines. It's like the map of important places changes. The center of gravity moves. Chaco is not the only magnet anymore. And communities adapt by building new forms of social stability in new places. Now, if you want one very human explanation for cliff dwellings that sometimes gets ignored, sometimes people build where they feel at home. If a community has lived near cliffs and alcoves for generations, those spaces become part of identity. They become part of story. They become part of what a good place feels like. So even if defense and climate matter, culture matters too. The architecture isn't only a reaction to fear, it's also an expression of belonging and knowledge. Knowledge of stonework, knowledge of the landscape, knowledge of how to make a hard environment livable. Let's talk briefly about what daily life might have looked like in a cliff dwelling, because it's easy to romanticize them as stone condos in the rocks. In reality, they were tight. Space is limited. Movement is vertical, ladders, steps, narrow passages. Smoke management matters. Water hauling is still work. Food processing is still work. Kids still run around, which is wild when you're looking at a village with sheer drop-offs nearby. Storage becomes crucial. Social life becomes intense because you're close to your neighbors all the time.
And that closeness can be comforting and stressful both. But again, the fact that these places were carefully built tells you people knew how to live there. It wasn't a desperate improvisation, it was a practiced adaptation. So what's the takeaway as we leave this chapter? It's that the move to the cliffs isn't a single event with a single cause. It's a visible marker of a period when communities were responding to multiple pressures at once: environmental uncertainty, rising tension in some areas, changing networks, and social reorganization. Cliff dwellings are the dramatic expression of those responses. They show resilience, they show engineering skill, they show community. They also hint that the region is entering a more fragile phase, where choices about where to live, how to protect resources, and how to maintain social cohesion become more urgent. Next chapter, we're going to tackle the hard one, the 13th century crisis, and the big question everyone asks: why did people leave so many of these places? We'll talk drought and climate evidence, yes, but also the domino effects, resource depletion, social stress, conflict, and the very human reality that sometimes the smartest survival move is not to cling to a place, but to reorganize and move on.
Now we get to the part of the story people always call the collapse. And I want to handle that word carefully because it makes it sound like everything fell apart overnight. What really seems to happen in the late 1100s and especially the 1200s is slower and uglier, a long squeeze where environmental stress and social stress start feeding each other. The headline factor is drought. We're not guessing in a vague way here. Tree ring records across the Southwest show extended dry periods, including a severe late 1200s episode often called the Great Drought. And if you're farming in an arid region, drought isn't just less rain, it's a chain reaction. Less rain means lower yields. Lower yields mean less surplus. Less surplus means you can't absorb the next bad year. And once that buffer shrinks, every decision gets sharper and more political. Who gets food first? Who gets access to water? Who stays near the best fields? Who has to move? Who has the authority to decide? And who refuses to accept the decision? On top of that, there's resource strain. Populations had grown in many areas. Wood is cut for fuel and construction. Nearby game becomes harder to find. Soils can get worked harder. And in good times, you can manage that. In bad times, it stacks up. By the 1200s, in many places, the system has less slack, which is exactly when conflict tends to rise. Conflict is a sensitive topic here because it's been sensationalized, but the responsible version is simple. In some parts of the region, the archaeological record shows signs consistent with increased violence, more defensive site placement, fortifications, and in some cases, trauma on human remains. That doesn't mean every community lived in constant war, but it does suggest that insecurity was rising in certain times and places. And insecurity doesn't only mean raids, it can mean quieter breakdown too. Alliances fray, communities split, leadership is challenged, and trust in regional systems weakens. That matters because centers and networks only function when people believe they're worth the cost. If you're contributing labor, goods, or participation to a wider system and the system stops delivering stability because harvests are failing or because travel is less safe, then the logic of staying tightly connected changes. The agreement gets renegotiated. The ceremonies can still be meaningful, but you can't ritual your way out of an empty granary. So people adapt, and adaptation at this scale often looks like reorganization, aggregation in some places, dispersal in others, new settlement patterns,
new alliances, and, crucially, migration. This is where I push back hard on the idea that departure equals failure. From a survival standpoint, leaving can be the smartest move a community makes. If the local environment is hitting its limits and the social situation is unstable, moving your household, your relatives, your knowledge, and your traditions to a more reliable region is not giving up, it's choosing continuity over stubbornness. And the evidence often suggests this wasn't random flight in the night. It looks like planned movement over time, guided by kin ties, known water sources, and existing social connections. Some sites show burning, yes, but burning can mean conflict, and it can also mean intentional closure, ritual endings, deliberate abandonment practices, a way of saying, this chapter is done. Archaeology can't always tell us which in every case, so we stay honest about uncertainty. The big picture is that by the late 1200s, many of the famous communities in the northern Southwest are being left behind. That can feel heartbreaking when you're staring at stone rooms still tucked into alcoves, but it makes sense in the long view. Drought reduces food security, resource stress grows, conflict risk rises, social trust strains, and eventually the safest option is to move toward regions with more reliable water and stronger networks. So instead of imagining collapse as a wipeout, it's more accurate to imagine a reshuffling of the map, where older centers lose population and new centers gain it, and communities carry their identities forward while adapting their architecture, their farming strategies, and their social organization to new circumstances. And that sets us up for the next chapter, because once you accept that the real story is migration and recentering, not disappearance, then the question becomes not where did they go in a spooky way, but how did they move, where did they reform, and how do modern Pueblo communities carry that history today? Let's take this seriously and say it plainly. They did not vanish. That word is catchy, it sounds dramatic, and it's been repeated for so long that people treat it like a fact. But it's the wrong frame. What actually happens after the late 1100s, and especially in the 1200s, is not magic and not a blank spot in history. It's a long, hard process of movement and reorganization. People leave some places. They stop maintaining certain buildings. They shift where they farm, where they gather, where they build the next chapter of their lives. That's not disappearance. That's migration. And migration can be one of the most deliberate, strategic things a society does. When we say migration here, we should not picture one dramatic day when everyone packs up and walks away together. Think slower and more realistic. Think households moving over years and decades. Think groups splitting and rejoining. Think people scouting, choosing routes, testing new fields, leaning on kin ties and alliance ties, and then bringing others along when a place proves workable. Think of it as a map gradually changing shape, not a light switching off. And the destinations aren't random. Broadly, many communities shift toward regions with more reliable water and different farming options, including movement toward the Rio Grande and toward areas tied to the Little Colorado River and surrounding drainages. You see populations consolidating in some valleys. You see larger pueblos becoming more prominent. You see continuity in material traditions, even as styles evolve, which is exactly what you'd expect if people moved rather than vanished. They bring knowledge with them. They bring seeds. They bring tools. They bring ways of building, ways of cooking, ways of organizing ceremonies, ways of raising children, ways of remembering. And that continuity matters because it tells you something basic. The story doesn't end at an empty building. It continues through people. Now here's the part that often gets missed. A lot of the most important history in this region is not sitting in written documents. It lives in community memory, in language, in story, in place-based knowledge, and in traditions that connect landscape to identity. That doesn't mean outsiders get to know every detail, and it doesn't mean every story is meant to be public. It just means the absence of alphabetic writing is not the absence of history. Archaeology adds another layer. You can track settlement shifts. You can watch older centers decline while new ones grow. You can see technologies and styles transform rather than snap off. That pattern is exactly what recentering looks like. And that brings us back to the question in the title: what really happened at Chaco Canyon? The sober answer is that Chaco's role changed as the regional situation changed. The network that helped make Chaco powerful, its connections, its gatherings, its labor investment, its shared timing, became harder to sustain when drought, resource stress, and social tension increased. So people adapted. Some stopped coming as often, some shifted their commitments, some moved their lives toward other regions where farming was less risky and social stability could be rebuilt. Nothing about that requires mystery in a supernatural sense. It requires only the kind of decision-making humans have always done under pressure. And here's the last thing I want you to hold on to, because it's the real legacy. The most impressive part of this story is not only that people built monumental places in a harsh landscape, it's that when conditions changed over generations, communities found ways to keep going. Sometimes the way to keep going is to stay and endure. Sometimes the way to keep going is to move, regroup, and rebuild somewhere else. Leaving is not the same thing as failing. In many cases, leaving is how continuity survives. So when you stand among the great houses, or when you look at an empty cliff dwelling, you're not looking at a vanished people. You're looking at a chapter boundary. The stone is what stayed behind. The living story kept moving. Thank you so much for watching our video and supporting the channel. See you in the next episodes, and good night.